2 days remain to elections in Israel, and the final polls show Prime Minister Netanyahu making gains against his rivals in the home stretch. In a final mass protest before the elections, thousands of demonstrators gathered in Jerusalem last night to call for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to resign. And a new survey finds a rise in pro-Israel sympathies across Europe after some of the positive developments this last year. We'll discuss. Hello, you're watching I-24 News. Thanks for joining us this hour live from Tel Aviv. I'm David Matlin here with a look at the hour's latest. Now, just 2 days remain until Election Day in Israel, and the now final and recent polls here show Prime Minister Netanyahu making some gains against his rivals in this home stretch of the campaigns. Now, in recent weeks, opposition leader Yair Lapid had issued an open call to Netanyahu to engage with him in a televised debate, not been held by front-running Israeli party leaders since 1999. But it appears no debate will take place as Lapid calls Netanyahu, quote-unquote, scared, and the prime minister says Lapid is simply refusing to admit that he is running for the premiership. For now, with the vote on Tuesday, the various parties are divided along lines of pro or anti-Netanyahu, who, for his part, seeks to extend his unprecedented 12-year run as head of state. Now, the leader of the ultra-Orthodox United Torah Judaism Party, excuse me, Moshe Gafni, that is, now said yesterday that his party will, quote-unquote, weigh its options if Prime Minister Netanyahu does not secure a majority coalition on Tuesday's election. The list of potential partners for Netanyahu's Likud party have been reduced to in this round now to the ultra-Orthodox and the far-right parties, with some speculation still around Naftali Bennett's Yamina party. Now, the statement by Gafni thus carries some significance as United Torah Judaism has been a key partner in Netanyahu's bloc, which has so far relied on them to so far prevent the formation of a more centrist or even secular coalition now after these previous elections. Now we're joined by Dalia Schenlin, the pollster and political strategist. Thanks for being with us, Dalia. How big a factor is the national fatigue right now? We're talking about the fourth election within 2 years, and many people, it feels, unsure who they'll vote for. What does that factor in?
When we talk about election fatigue, usually people think it's going to matter in terms of voter turnout and expect a plunge in voter turnout. So far, we're not seeing a major indication of a sharp drop in voter turnout in the surveys yet. Let's remember that there's a big difference between levels of Jewish turnout versus Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, who usually have lower turnout than Jews. But I think that the fatigue is seen in the stability of the vote when it comes to supporting parties that support Netanyahu or oppose Netanyahu. And the most striking thing is the consistency of the surveys in reaching the same deadlock on that issue that we've seen in all three previous cycles. We don't know what's going to happen on Election Day, but as of the final polls that were released on Friday, and I collected 6 different polls that were released on Friday, the last day when polls could be published, and the average is simply 60-60 out of 120 parliamentary seats. Like in every other cycle, Netanyahu does not have a majority. The opposition does not have a majority. We're looking at a deadlock, and what will break that deadlock is not the voters, but the decisions of the party leaders, who I hope this time will come to a decision that leads to a government, at least, so we don't go into a fifth election, but it's not an impossibility.
Well, along those lines, then, considering the prospects for a functioning government are as narrow as ever, what do you see in terms of the possibilities for a functional government to emerge?
It's not impossible that on Election Day, Netanyahu does emerge with 61 seats. We have seen that in the final week, Likud rose slightly in the polls with, the average perhaps 2 weeks ago was 28, 29 seats, and he ended the final week with about 30 seats on average. One poll even had him at 32 seats. It wouldn't be the first time that his final count on Election Day rises above the very last polls as the undecided make their decisions and people who weren't sure gravitate towards the big parties. So Likud could well do better and maybe even above 32 seats. The main question is whether those additional seats come from additional voters or whether he simply takes away from parties within the bloc of parties who are already supporting him for a coalition, in which case it doesn't mean he has 61. But if he takes them away from Gideon Sa'ar, who has run on a platform of forging a government without him, if he takes those voters back, or reaches new voters, undecided voters, those who weren't sure if they were planning to turn out, or Arab voters, and then he really could reach over 60, and it's not that far off because he is at an average of 60 seats right now. That's one option. We may see a winner emerge on election day or on election night or maybe Wednesday, and that would be Netanyahu. The other option is that he doesn't reach 60 or 61. He has 59 or 60 seats of parties that support him. There are more seats going to the opposition parties. I call them opposition for shorthand because they're not necessarily opposed to Netanyahu ideologically. They're opposed to his leadership. And those parties enter a negotiation for a coalition. They will have a hard path because they have already expressed too many boycotts of one another for forging a coalition. But in that case, there is a slightly higher likelihood that one of the pro-Netanyahu parties, Naftali Bennett's Yamina, could break away from the Netanyahu bloc and join the opposition bloc. And if that happens, it opens up more potential permutations that could lead to an opposition government, but it won't be easy to make a decision over who will be prime minister, Yair Lapid, Gideon Sa'ar, or Naftali Bennett, or a rotation of some sort. It will be a complex animal in that case. And the other option is fifth elections.
Now, for so many years, arguably throughout Israel's history, exit polls across the spectrum have indicated security is the main factor driving Israelis' decisions at the polls. With the coronavirus largely on its way out here, the vaccine campaign so successful, the economic hardship, is it a different set of factors right now in terms of looking at the economy? And in that light, do the last year's events since the last elections, do they play in the favor of Prime Minister Netanyahu, likely to have a boost from the situation?
I'm sorry to disappoint you, but there's very little that's changing the position of Netanyahu throughout this time. He has consistently retained his position as the top party, still with insufficient votes for a majority. His range is in the upper 20s to the mid 30s, and it has not changed. Now, I will make a slight correction. Polls generally show that security is very high priority. But whenever security threats recede, when we're not in an active situation of escalation or war, the economic issues are number one. The two issues, economy and security, always jockey for number one when we ask the public about their national most urgent priorities. By that, they mean cost of living, which is, high and troubling for people long before Corona. So that issue is always there. The problem is that economic issues don't really divide the Israeli public. There's much more agreement than disagreement. So it doesn't truly affect how people vote. It's just another factor that people point to if they want to point to Israel's strong macroeconomic data as a reason to support Netanyahu, or the deep and severe inequalities in Israel, economic inequalities, if they oppose Netanyahu. And the corona crisis hasn't truly changed that. It's just introduced a new set of factors that go into how people already see the economy, which is basically boosting their pre-existing political positions for or against Netanyahu. And that's why I don't think we've seen his position change very much, despite the severe economic crisis, massive unemployment over the course of the year. And the same is basically true about the vaccination campaign. Across the board, people give him credit for having run a successful vaccine rollout. Israel is very, thrilled and appreciative, and I don't think takes it for granted that the vaccines have been distributed so efficiently. The economy is opening up.
Still a contest around votes. Yeah, still a contest certainly around the position and personality of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Dalia Shenlin, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, just ahead of these elections here, one last mass protest took place last night in Jerusalem, still calling for the resignation of Prime Minister Netanyahu here. This has been an ongoing movement for the last 9 months or more here. Here's some of the protesters themselves.
If Netanyahu succeeds in establishing extreme right-wing government and trying to avoid his trial by any new kind of French law or whatever, then the people are going to be mad and it's going to be spontaneous.
We are here to protest against Netanyahu and his corrupted government. This is our last chance before the election. We want everyone to come and vote to change. Vote to exchange this government. 3 days from now, there will be the election, and we would like to see a change. This is why I'm here. This is what everybody here is expecting.
Now, stepping out for a short break here at I-24 News. Just 2 minutes. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Take a look at other stories, including a new survey out of Europe that sympathies for Israel have grown across the continent this last year. We'll explain. Stay with us.
Zoom in past the sound bites and beyond the numbers. Zoom in between the people and into the Middle East conflict. I'm Jeff Smith. Together, we'll zoom in Sunday through Thursday nights, only on I-24 News.
Welcome back to I-24 News. Thanks for staying with us through the break as we continue live from Tel Aviv here this hour. And with hundreds of thousands of Israelis typically living abroad at any given time, the country's lack of an absentee voting system places unique pressures on those citizens around elections, especially in this two-year time period and the fourth consecutive vote now just 2 days away. Now here's a look at the situation from Canadian journalist Robert Sarner for I-24 News.
While politicians in Israel make their final pitches to voters ahead of Tuesday's election, many Israelis outside the country are increasingly focused on their non-voting. In recent days, by way of Hebrew language Zoom events and call-in talk shows abroad, expatriate Israelis have been debating whether they should have the right to vote in Israeli elections. The law currently says the only non-resident Israelis allowed to vote are diplomats and other official emissaries. Even those out of the country temporarily, such as professors on sabbatical, students doing postgraduate studies, or doctors undergoing training, can't cast a ballot. Although the issue is not new, it's taken on a new relevance, in part due to travel restrictions linked to COVID that have prevented many Israelis from flying back to vote.
Part of the reason that it's raised now is because we are more organized as a community of expats, and we're more vocal in our participation in Israeli affairs at the moment.
Matt Yash, an Israeli musician living in Berlin since 2016, is leading a grassroots movement known in English as Vote Abroad Israel. Its goal? To have the law changed so Israeli citizens outside the country can vote in elections. As part of their campaign, they've launched a website and a petition, are active on social media, and will engage all MKs elected to the next Knesset. But not everyone agrees.
As an Israeli who lives abroad, I don't think that we have the right to influence the politics in Israel. If we don't live there, we don't pay tax there, we don't serve in the military there, or we don't pay our dues. And in the end of the day, we still have the right, but it's going to be in a cost of a plane ride to Israel.
If Israelis abroad were granted the right to vote, their electoral impact would be significant, given they number between an estimated 500,000 to 800,000. With little available data, it's unclear which political parties would benefit most. Despite the challenges ahead, those involved in the Vote Abroad Israel initiative are upbeat about their prospects.
I'm optimistic, and I think I have good reason to be, because this is not the first time the subject is raised. It's been a discussion on and off for the past 20 years. There is a lot of research that has already been done. We're not alone in this. There are a lot of countries around the world who are currently re-examining their laws. I think Greece just recently passed legislation allowing expat Greeks to vote. So this is really an issue of our times, and I think that we're ready to deal with it.
If some Israelis abroad reject this initiative, it's safe to say almost all share an interest in Tuesday's vote. Organizers of the campaign say that unlike most issues in Israel, this is not a partisan question. And while they're confident that they will ultimately succeed, they know they still have a long way to go before the law will be changed. This is Robert Sarner reporting for I-24 News in Toronto.
And looking at the coronavirus updates here in Israel, up to 8,000 Israelis now per day will be allowed to travel through Ben Gurion Airport, and that begins today after restrictions on the movement of citizens expired at midnight last night. Now, following a high court ruling last week, now deemed those restrictions against the civil rights. Without any absentee ballot system, though, as we just detailed there, Israelis have been trying to come home ahead of Tuesday's election, following weeks of stringent limitations aimed at stopping the spread of coronavirus variants. Now, in the face of these easing regulations, though, health officials expressed some concern that infection rates still on the rise in many countries around the world. Now, new daily infections have been dropping in Israel rapidly, with just a 1.8% infection rate yesterday, and now more than 4.5 million Israelis already fully vaccinated. Looking at the Palestinian Authority here, President Mahmoud Abbas received his first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine on Saturday, all ahead of the start of the vaccination drive in the West Bank and Gaza. And over 61,000 vaccine doses reportedly arrived in Ramallah last week after the part of the first delivery of the United Nations COVAX program, with some 20,000 of those doses going directly to the Gaza Strip. According to the reports here, the Palestinian vaccination drive will begin with those aged over 75, cancer patients, and medical personnel. Now, 20 countries in the European Union have seen an increased COVID-19 infection rate this week. Europe's struggle to speed up the inoculation drive, coupled with the rise in infections, has forced several countries back into lockdowns. Here's the latest by I-24 News' Georgia Barnett.
Fears of a third coronavirus wave are escalating throughout Europe, and several countries are locking down to combat the spread. But their decision to do so has not been taken lightly.
This is the centre of freedom, freedom of speech and freedom of association.
We are here today in University Square to protest the restrictions imposed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. These restrictions affect us economically, socially, culturally.
Germany is one of 20 countries on the continent that have warned of an exponential growth in infections. With only 8.5% of Germany's population having received their first dose, the temporary suspension of the AstraZeneca vaccine has further slowed significant inoculation progress.
The motto is vaccinate, vaccinate, and vaccinate. We want to get on as fast and as flexible as possible with the vaccination process.
A sluggish rollout has impacted several EU nations, with Poland recording the largest amount of residents on ventilators since the pandemic began. Italy is considering importing the Sputnik V vaccine after becoming the third country to exceed 100,000 deaths last week. And a partial Paris lockdown is in action. But for the UK, things are looking up.
I'm absolutely delighted to tell you that we have now vaccinated half of all adults in the United Kingdom. It's a huge success. I want to say many, many thanks to all those involved, including the half of all adults who've come forward. It's so important because this vaccine is our way out of this pandemic.
With a slow-paced vaccination drive making the rise of new variants all the more likely, for most of Europe, the road to recovery is a bumpy one.
Information coming out of Europe here. A recent survey by the research institute YouGov is reporting increased sympathetic attitudes towards Israel across the continent. Now, the main countries surveyed were the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. And now the two main reasons behind the uptick in support were the normalization agreements that Israel signed with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and the country's successful coronavirus vaccination campaign, which has been noticed the world over. Now, with an overall 8% increase in positive attitudes toward Israel, the survey found a 50% jump in France, for example. Now, to get more on these results and what they really might mean here, we're joined by Lior Hayat, the spokesman for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thanks for being with us here. Looking at these survey results, how do you explain the rise? We see the factors that they seem to be looking at favorably, but this comes really after some years of dismal figures out of Europe towards Israel. So this clearly a new chapter of relations, or at least a new perspective?
First of all, hello, everyone. It's actually, we see the change in a matter of a policy, we've seen Europe as an important area for Israel, and we also see Israel as an important partner for Europe. And since the Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi entered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs almost 8 months ago, he decided to put Israel as Europe, as in the center of our attention. We had over 20 visits from high-level authorities from Europe. We've been working with them. The foreign ministers visited Europe at least twice, and he met with all the foreign ministers in Europe. And I think that the main thing was a change in a dialogue. Instead of talking about annexation, we're talking about normalization. And there's a change in the way that Europeans see Israel. They see Israel as an asset to Europe, both in the changes that we've been living in the Middle East in the last few months, but also in the way that Israel has been treating the COVID-19 crisis.
And coupled with all that, it's been a year of notable lack of major conflict on the Palestinian front. Must have some to do with the perceptions around Europe as well. But looking at this positive element we're in here from the foreign ministry perspective, what opportunities can emerge from this? What new doors may be open?
I think this is just the beginning of a change, and we're far from being satisfied with that. You mentioned that there wasn't a major conflict with the Palestinians, and that's true, but we can also see that over the last 13 years, there have been a decrease of many percentage of the way the European media has been covering Israel. Back in 2008, 68% of the news from Israel were conflict-related. And now we're talking about less than 30%, which is a major change. Europeans read more about Israel, but more about technology in Israel, more about tourism in Israel, more about health issues in Israel, and less about the conflict in Israel. And it changes the way they look at Israel. We have to continue to create those different bridges of dialogue with with Europe and with the Europeans in general. And we have to understand that there are forces within Europe that are trying to get the dialogue back to where they feel comfortable with, which is a conflict dialogue. I think we are heading towards the right place, but we are far from being satisfied.
Well, certainly still work to be done. Thanks for being with us here, Lior Hayat from the Israeli Foreign Ministry.
Thank you so much.
Now, a volcanic eruption in Iceland on Friday created some spectacular sights here and took place after months of earthquakes, actually now coming to the relief of some citizens. Our Erica Jackson takes a look.
Lava continuing to flow after a volcano near Iceland's capital, Reykjavik, erupted for the first time in about 6,000 years on Friday. Iceland is no stranger to volcanic activity, but it was the first volcanic eruption in almost 800 years in this area of the country, which is the most heavily populated part. Though the eruption was considered small, it still created a fissure that was about 1,640 feet long and spewed over 10 million square feet of lava, which at times reached heights of more than 300 feet. But the eruption was far away enough that evacuations weren't needed, while structures weren't endangered.
This is in some ways as harmless as an eruption to see as you can expect. But actually surprisingly little to look at in terms of what eruptions can be.
The eruption also not disrupting flights, with Iceland's international air traffic hub, Keflavik Airport, saying flights staying on schedule since the eruption started.
This eruption will not affect air traffic, no. This is an effusive eruption, which means that it's mostly producing lava. The smoke that is coming out of it is minor. There's no ash coming from it. So there is no air traffic considerations that we have to worry about.
The volcano also spewing activity on social media, with singer Björk taking to Instagram to write, "Yes, eruption. We in Iceland are so excited." A seismologist in Iceland also taking to Twitter to write, "First photo of the eruption. Wow." The volcanic activity had taken place after over 40,000 small earthquakes happened in Iceland in recent weeks.
That's all for updates this hour at I-24 News. As always, thanks for joining us. I'm David Matlin, live in Tel Aviv.